Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. This will be part 2 in a series looking at the ancient alchemists, the secrets of alchemy, with a focus on distillation, but it will connect to many recent uploads in regards to the origin of Hermes and the knowledge of Hermes, where it comes from, the quadrivium, many other aspects. I'll link some videos in the description. But in this particular one I want to examine the ancient Egyptian alchemy, and by alchemy I'm really talking about the science and the chemistry, and how that was so important to all cultures, but ancient Egyptian culture. They were doing metalwork, using medicinal chemistry to process plants and herbs, but also in the production of glass, ceramics, and these other items which were essential to their civilization. So distillation, the alembic or the still, that's connected with moonshine. So we're distilling spirits and alcohol. Distilling also applies to perfumes and medicines, extracting oils for etc. We use the same process in oil refineries, but it's looking at alchemy and the concept of secrecy and professional secrecy, but also this would strongly apply because the modern alchemists or chemists and physicists or those engaged in science of quadrivium, the secrecy, especially involving corporate secrets, military secrets, the importance of before has not really changed now. So it's not, we shouldn't separate it too much. So armies, navies, air force, construction, medicine, banking, the alchemical arts are at the heart of power now, as they were in the past. So whenever I'm referring to the alchemical craft, I'm really talking about science, chemistry, but this would relate, of course, to geometry, maths, astronomy, and physics, and these other aspects. But the ancient sciences, people like modern science, we look at it differently, and there's a tendency to look back on the past as if they're sort of all hokey and superstitious. But they were doing great feats and great works of engineering on industrial scale, so keep that in mind. They're not as simple. But so previously I looked at the history of distillation, and it was a short version, but we can look at that again. So definitely in the medieval, early Renaissance distillation, many books published on that, and even surviving artifacts. One of the important instruments of distillation, so this is an old catalogue of glassware for the alchemist, but we have this, that's the retort, as it would modern one looks now, but of course even back in the day they made them out of ceramic, also out of copper. It's an essential part in the distillation process with this retort. Now will be an important feature. A very important alchemical text was De Re Metallica by George Agricole. It was a very complex encyclopedia on metalworking especially, but with metalworking you also have to work with chemicals such as sulfur and arsenic and mercury, and also essentially the processes in distillation refer to the furnaces to separate metals, and using different heats and various techniques. So very rarely do you find pure gold or pure silver, or you find ores and minerals which then have to be broken down, and then the lead separated from the gold, from the iron, etc. And this book, De Re Metallica, is a very important text, but it's also very important because it's written in almost plain language, but most alchemists write in very exotic forms, poetic forms sometimes even. This was written more in a more textbook way. So this is from De Re Metallica, seeing that there are so few who have written on the subject of metals, alchemists have arisen. But what the important parts, he mentions Hermes, Zosimus, Cleopatra, Maria the Jewess, and Geber. And Geber's a very important alchemist. But he also says all these alchemists employ obscure language, and he goes on to refer to Augurellus as alone has used the language of poetry. There are ancient medicinal alchemy which was written in poetic form, but I want to do that in future episodes. But that's important. All these alchemists employ obscure language, as where his text was more plain speak. President Hoover, Herbert Hoover, he published the first complete English translation, and in his notes he mentions it. There was a letter by the Elector Augustus to Agricole, 1555, most learned and dear faithful subject, etc., etc. It is our gracious command that you should get the book translated when you have the opportunity into German, and not let it be copied more than once or be printed, but keep it by you and send us a copy. This is an important concept. Keep it secret, keep it safe. And the secrecy in regards to alchemy, especially metallurgy, but this applies also to medicines, glass making, dyes and pigments. This was a huge industry, and it also has military applications, so it's ever so important. But 8th century, the Arab alchemists, such as Geber, were writing on, well, alchemy, metallurgy, chemistry of medicines as well. But it's an important feature. So Geber, very, very influential to the medieval European hermeticists and alchemists. The word gibberish arrives from Geber, and I'll show you in a moment, but notice the retort here, the tools of distillation. I'll link this in also in the description, but the alembic, this is a tool of distillation. Geber designed the alembic pot. Well, he designed one and refined it and did it, but he wrote on it, but we'll see that this is actually quite old, the distillation process. But the alembic has Geber and other Arab alchemists place it back even further to Maria the Jewess in 3rd, 4th century AD, and also Cleopatra the alchemist in 3rd, 4th century BC. In his book, Geber states in the Book of Stones, the purpose is to baffle and lead into error everyone except those whom God loves and provides for. And the writer states, his works seem to have been deliberately written in a highly esoteric code, so that only those who had been initiated into his alchemical school could understand them. Along with the symbols, but also the text, this was the practice, the standard. And again, as Agricole states, all these alchemists employ obscure language. This was the way things are done, and that's why the word gibberish, because it was not under, this is gibberish, but you have to be an initiate to understand it's the esoteric nature of these exoteric works, to keep these very potent scientific, military, banking, navigation, industry secrets secret. Notice again the retort, this will be an important feature. And of course, Agricola mentions Geber, but he also mentions Zosimus. So Zosimus the Alexandrian, but he's also referred to as Zosimus of Panopolis, which is further south in Egypt. So that's why I haven't put him up here. But Zosimus, 3rd century, he wrote on distillation, but he also his work in regards to arsenic, very important as well. I mentioned that in part 1 a little bit more. But also 1st century AD, Dioscorides, De Materia Medica, his very important book on medicine, herbs, but also substances such as sulfur and other chemicals as we would think of them, were also very important in the ancient medicine texts. Evidence of in northern India, Punjab, Pakistan border as well, that distillation was occurring there, and Dioscorides mentions distillation. Agricole again mentions Cleopatra the alchemist as well as Maria the Jewess. She would have been around the time of Zosimus, but 4th century BC, all these, the Arab and European alchemists all refer to Cleopatra the alchemist, whether she was a true person, but they credit her with the invention of the alembic, which is that distillation tool. Evidence in the 12th century BC in Mesopotamia, in the artefacts, but also in the written tablets, which would also maybe push it back a little bit further, but rather solid evidence for it there. I'll skip that one. 5th century BC, using terracotta pots in India as well, and also as Paolo Ravesti reported that not only do they find evidence in the Indus Valley civilization, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, etc., of the instruments of distillation, but chemical analysis of those showed that the process was happening. And so for perfumes especially, and oils, distillation very important. We most connect distillation to production of spirits and alcohols, but they're also important in medicine still now. Distilled water, distilled alcohol to make tinctures, for instance, but so many applications of this far beyond just having a drink, but metallurgy, glass making, perfumes, dyes, etc. It's just an essential process in chemistry. So Cleopatra the alchemist, the alembic, Zosimus down here in Panopolis, sometimes referred to as Zosimus the Alexandrian, but 3rd century AD, 4th, 3rd century BC, we have Cleopatra the alchemist, and now we have Saqqara, so not too far south from the major pyramids. This is the pyramids of Unas, which have a pyramid of Unas, which includes the oldest pyramid texts. Very important because this has applications in there too. References are in regards to natron, the faience, the blue and green glass, but that's just in the shadow, not too far from the stepped pyramid or pyramid of Djoser. And now I want to present evidence of distillation in Egypt, 2400, 2500 BC, and I believe it's just been, well, sort of sitting in plain sight. This would relate to Ptah, who was the god of craftsmen and god of architects, and also the god of metalworking. So in recent uploads I looked at arsenic, dwarves, green skin, and that relationship with copper. So as a in there I won't, but the copper of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, is not the soft copper used by modern reconstructions. They were using arsenical copper and arsenical bronze, which is different. So it's like you don't, if you wanted to reconstruct a steel tool, you wouldn't use a piece of iron, and to reconstruct ancient Egyptian Mesopotamian weapons and tools, you wouldn't use soft copper, but for some reason the reconstructions use pure modern soft copper as opposed to the copper alloys that they were using. So that's, I mentioned, went into it further. But this would also, Ptah, god of craftsmen needing to be skilled, so whether they're making ceramics or glass, metallurgy, stoneworking, they have to have scientific skills, practice to make those tools to do their work. That also relate to paintings of tombs. It's color making. You can't just get a green leaf and make a green color from it. It's not the way that coloring works, especially if you're doing ceramics or on tomb paintings or on papyrus. The chemistry, the science of color making, very important as well. But Sheshet, she is the goddess of science, of architecture, the houses of life, which were the universities and record keeping sites in ancient Egypt, astronomy, geometry, etc. She's the female equivalent of Thoth. But gods of architecture, builders, Ptah and Sheshet are related in several ways actually. And so this is a tomb of Nefer at Saqqara, 5th dynasty, 25th century BC, and he was during the reign of Nuisere. Pardon the, it's always a tongue twister for me, but there's hidden in plain sight, there's some information. Links in the description, but I couldn't find the exact picture from the tomb of Nefer, but they were two pairs of dwarves are portrayed in the craft of jewelry making. This is nearby, again at Saqqara, Old Kingdom, but we see dwarves making jewelry. And that would relate to recent videos. So for instance, Ptah, god of craftsmen and architects, his statue at Memphis, he was depicted as a dwarf, green-skinned, and dwarves being a feature. Some couple recent uploads, I'll put these in the description. If you haven't seen the arsenic and copper ancient alchemy, because I go into Mohs scale and a lot of the problems in regards to the copper argument in regards to ancient stonemasonry. Anyway, that's in that particular video. So Ptah, god of craftsmen, god of architecture, related to metalworking and how this would relate. And his high priest of Ptah was the chief controller of the craftsmen. as the god of craftsmen, as the god of metalworking and architects, and the high priest, chief controller of the craftsmen. So whether they're making glass, carving, pottery, all those instruments, weights and measures, this would all be interconnected to essentially what is the science. Artisans, craftsmen need these particular skills, and as is seen in places such as Thebes, they were usually separated from the rest of the population because their skills were highly sought after. Ancient kingdoms often traded textile workers, metal workers, etc. They were a commodity as much as anything else. So the importance of these skills and how information gets transmitted between societies as well, but especially weights and measures and the scales and science, which can also be found in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, for instance, and their other, now for instance, the plumb bob of the scales, in the weighing, measuring the feather against the heart in the Book of the Dead, the plumb bob of the scale, even the spell 125 of the Book of the Dead, I have not tampered with the measuring cord, I have not tampered with the plumb bob of a scale. So there are so many aspects in regards to weights, measures, knowledge to these ancient civilizations. But Nefer, I mentioned the Tomb of Nephal. Well, one of his titles, very important because he's wearing the leopard skin. It signifies he's very important, and also his tomb, the design of it, its location. But he was referred to as the supervisor of the artisans, the supervisor of the craftsmen. And so this would be a direct connection, a keeper of the secrets. Also, the leopard skin most often connected with Shesset, who was the goddess of knowledge, maths, astronomy. Her primary sanctuary was at Heliopolis. She was the inventor of writing, so goddess of scribes, goddess of architecture and surveying. Pardon the typo. Foremost of the builders was just one of her titles. So surveying, architecture, scribes, record keeping. She was the female counterpart of Thoth. I'll put the link in the description. I did as a playlist on Shesset as well, but also a related one in regards to Heliopolis, because they're interrelated, they were connected in Heliopolis, this important center, the Ennead, the 9 gods of Lower Egypt, the land of the pyramids, and Shesset and her importance in these places, but also connected in other sites. I've done a few other videos as well looking into Shesset. But the Palomo stone was the Royal Annals. Now it's called the Palomo stone because the largest pieces are in the Palomo Museum. Some pieces are in Cairo, some are in London, but they're very important because they record the yearly flooding of the Nile. They also record important ceremonies such as stretching the cord ceremony. They also record pre-dynastic kings. Tendency is to look at the kings list in Abydos. This is I don't know why the Palomo stone is not front and center, but we have these pre-dynastic kings, so before Nama or Menes as he's called. But the important part will be here, the 5th dynasty, where we have kings such as Unas and the pyramid texts. So Nefer was during the time of Neusere, and you even notice how like Re, a lot of these pharaohs end with Re at the end, or Ra. Well, that's Ra or Re, and the importance of the sun cults at those times. Neusere's reign, here it shows 35 years. There's a lot of arguments exactly how long it went, but it's very important that if it got to 35 years. Now, he's a very important pharaoh, and again, not spoken of probably as much as maybe he deserves. But if he did reign for 35 years or even 31, that would make him very important, because that would allow him to conduct the Heb Sed festival, which Sed, or the wolf god of the past as well. But a king had to reign for 30 years to be granted this festival. This is an ivory showing King Den running the Heb Sed. Now we see the section on Den from the Palomo stones and the Royal Annals. This will relate directly to Ptah, god of craftsmen, architects, and Shesset, goddess of science, scribes, maths, architects, because the master of ceremonies in the Heb Sed is referred to as being Ptah, as Sheshet, who's important in regards to timekeeping, measurement. She's the goddess of weights and measures. She grants the Hebsed to the pharaoh. Very important festival. But gods of knowledge, architecture, gods of sciences will be linked. And now we go to ancient Egyptian alchemy. So firstly, more common out. So we're looking at the great cathedrals and these types of buildings. Well, what are the alchemists engaged in? So whether it was pigments and dyes, metalwork, which would relate to stoneworking as well, or even things such as the glass, but also stained glass. So colouring glass is not as easy as making a blue paint and adding it to the glass. It's more complex than that. And that would also relate to ceramics and glazes on ceramics as well. But this is the secrets of alchemy. So here we see this is the tomb of Khuwy. Again, of the pronunciation. But this is Old Kingdom, and this is a classic example of the colours used in there and how to mix these colours. It was recently opened, 4,500 years old, and the colour still remains in there. This is not just some basic pigment. This was skill to make these variety of colours, and that they were so strong and they remain such a long time. So colours and pigments, just like these fabulous paintings. This is another scene from his tomb as well. So it looks brand new, but just like those beautiful colours that remain in the old master paintings and also in the cathedrals and so forth, it's a high level of skill involved. Metalwork is another obvious aspect of alchemy, and whether it's a copper, their gold, and the metals of ancient Egypt. Very proficient and in large quantities as well. So we only see a fraction of the surviving objects have been remained, but in ancient Egyptian copper mines and the gold mines, from the slag we have a very good idea, and the remnants of the smelting, we have a very good idea of the minimum that they were producing, and they were producing it in vast quantities, industrial scale. Glass would also reply, and I'll include ceramics in there because we have this faience, which is technically a ceramic, but this ancient Egyptian glass, this blue and these other colours. This would also relate to later glass makers, also alchemists, the apothecary trade as well. But these are some examples of this ancient craft. This all relates back to alchemy in general, or chemistry, but distillation is a very important feature, essential feature in these skills. So the modern still or a oil refinery, but here in this image of distillation we see a retort. It's a very important instrument in it's throughout this whole image, but distillation, very, very important. Here are some modern and some older examples of a retort. This is how you would work. So just like in a modern version, if I was to put a Bunsen burner underneath here, that would boil, and then the vapor would condense, the steam, and drip, 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 and that's even the word distillation comes from, to drip down. So this would be distillation using a retort. Well, now we come back to the tomb of Khuwy. Again, pronunciations when these things always gets me a little bit. This is his tomb in Saqqara, 25th century BC, during the reign of the king Nefer and Khuwy. And back to the royal annals, there we see Nefer and Khuwy, 2475 to 2465. Again, give or take, but there's amongst the scholars, there's quite they can range by quite a bit, but if you get it within 100 years, it's very, very old. While the tomb of Nephal, also in Saqqara, 25th century BC, during the Usuray, and that's 2455 to 2420. So again, that would make that particular king. So here you see Nefer and Khuwy pyramid and the Usuray pyramid in Saqqara. That's the location of a famed stepped pyramid, and we also have the important pyramid of Unas down here. So there's a step pyramid, looks smaller because it's in the background, but the pyramid of Unas, because we still have casing stones, and we say we can work out the base, therefore we work out the angle. Lovely information in these lesser known pyramids. There's excellent geometry, metrology happening, but the Tomb of Nephal was found, I couldn't get the precise location, but it's just to the south of the pyramid of Unas in a quarry cliff face. That's Nephal, but Nephal was connected to Neusere. There's a statue of that pharaoh being young and old, and there's the remains of his pyramid. So just like the Unas pyramid, his looks a bit ramshackle, but we have excellent idea of the size and of the angle. We only really need a couple of casing stones to get the angle, and we only need the footprint to get the size, and you can work out the rest. But there's amazing information being carried in these pyramids as well. But he's also famous for the Sun Temple at Abu Gorab, which was this, technically not an obelisk because it was of many, many pieces, but this is objects such as these connected to his temple as well, showing the skill of the stonework involved in there as well. The Neferkare pyramid, again, geometry, metrology, it's all, actually links, all the pyramids are linked in a wonderful way. But we see the tomb of Khuwy and 25th century. Again, there's nice information happening here. I'll put these video in the description playlist, especially part 4, because I go through these other lesser known pyramids and how the geometry, metrology connects, and it's very, very interesting. But now if we compare these two tomb paintings and illustrate, well, they have the offering table, that's very common, but there's actually, I believe, something that's been hidden in plain sight, that's just been looked over. And that is these in here. So we zoom in on those, and this one as well. What do we have? Well, a Maria's bath, said to be invented by Maria the Jewess, the alchemist. So we have a retort in boiling water rather than just under a Bunsen burner. We have distillation process, so alchemy and distillation. Well, if you compare, so I've tried to look and I could not find any convincing, any proper description of these instruments at all, and they resemble a retort, very, very almost identical to those features. And if you include the art forms at the time not being maybe 100% in their realism, but what happened would seem, now on its own that would just be a small thing, but given that Nefer was the artisan, and that whether it was glass making, metallurgy, colours and pigments, all within the precinct of the craftsman, and related to Ptah as well, of course, I believe that this is some very interesting evidence of distillation occurring in ancient Egypt, 25th century BC, much, much earlier than what is commonly accepted. And so it's not just the similarity of the objects, but you can even, not just the retort itself, but the resemblance with a Maria's bath, for instance, so boiling water being one way to do it and heat it up. Also, you could heat it up above 100 degrees using other elements as well. But of course, this all relates to ancient Egyptian alchemy or chemistry, because the glass, or I suppose technically it's more of a ceramic, to colour these they used copper, and I've mentioned arsenical copper, which is also related to natron and sulfur. These other very important chemicals which were used in the mummification process, but they're also essential in making proper not pure modern copper tools, but the ancient actual tools that they had. They're not pure copper. And this is also related to medicine as well. So sulfur was a common used in medicine, still is now, as is arsenic as well. So this connection between the chemistry and the surviving artifacts, and just this underappreciation, I believe, of the skill of the Egyptian scientists. And if you mention alchemy or ancient science, a lot of people just sort of glaze over and think, well, we're modern, but they did this, they made these things, and so how do we need to pay close attention and look at the details of these features, because, well, they tell us a story. So really when it comes to both for production of medicine, for the metalwork, for the ceramics, the dyes, the pigments, all that goes with it, would this actually really even be possible if they did not have distillation back in the Old Kingdom, possibly even pre-dynastic period? So that would be an interesting question that I can't really answer definitively, but even if you just look at the Wikipedia article in regards to this glass that they make and the processes and reconstructions, this is a very sophisticated production. That the colouring, it would relate to also, for instance, the use of copper. Natron was an essential element in there, and that would relate in future episodes. I want to look at Egyptian herbs and how they relate as well. But now, Dictionary of Assyrian Chemistry and Geology by Campbell Thompson, and in regards to this alchemical secret processes. So the ancient Egyptian mystery schools, the schools of life, are very mysterious, but I believe we can see a trace of what's surviving in the architecture and the artefacts, that this was quite a scientifically advanced, sophisticated civilization, and keep it secret, keep it safe. So in introduction, the latest discovery in ancient chemistry, a Babylonian tablet of the 17th century BC, gives a formula for making a lead glaze coloured with copper. It is written in just the same cryptographic method which is so beloved of those secretive alchemists of the Middle Ages, a very prototype of possibilities for which we must always be prepared. The fact that a familiarity with certain substances derived from research in natural secrets has not been shown earlier than in the writings of medieval chemists ought not to be allowed to prejudice us against the claims of the more ancient craftsmen, whose credit is so apparent in the many extant results of their skill. We have the artefacts. We don't have clear writings, but you don't need a book describing how to ride a car if the car is there and if it is present. This shows that they have those skills. It goes on in the next section, actually the whole thing, and there's so much more which I want to cover in the future, but this next section. First, the actual records are too scanty for us to be able to link up to two periods. Secondly, it has always been the outrageous custom of certain learned circles to conceal their knowledge from the lay world in a fog of jargon, a pomposity of mannerisms, due to, it is hoped, less to personal vanity than to professional protection. Thirdly, the knowledge of technical methods was closely guarded by each guild, a natural selfishness aided by the illiteracy of the artisans who handed down their discoveries from father to son by word of mouth, and consequently their processes, dependent on oral tradition, not complemented by the written word, ran a risk of oblivion. We find, so the guilds, so even just the craft guilds, the apothecaries, spectacle makers, the archers and the dye makers in the medieval Renaissance period, they did exactly the same thing. Most famously, the Murano glass of Venice. This was a very highly protective Bohemian glass crystal. The guilds kept this a secret. So the colours and the compositions of their glass or of their metals, of their dyes, of the medicines was a highly kept secret. So we find instructions for this secrecy as far back as the middle of the second millennium in a tablet of the Kassite period, which adds in colophon to the explanatory text with a warning: let him that knoweth show him that knoweth, and he that knoweth not, let him not see. Similar direction at the end of a 7th century medical text: let him that knoweth show him that knoweth, he that knoweth shall not show to him that knoweth not. Keep your secrets, keep your trade secrets. If you know, pass on from father to son, master to apprentice. Indeed, this jealousy is apparent often in the Jugine descriptions made by classical authors, which suggest at least the suspicion that their informants were none too ready to reveal the delicate mystery of their craft to the first inquisitive collector of natural history. Such a palisade of concealment is not confined to antiquity, and has persisted to the present day, particularly among the glassmakers who preserve not only the tradition of their ancestors' skill, but also their secretiveness. Military, industrial secrets, this is not a new thing, this is an ancient thing. And the alchemy involved in these, so even in the ancient times, so it's not just about a lack of surviving texts from the ancient times. The ancients were keep it secret, keep it safe. Only him that know to show him that know. Those who do not know should not see. Just as Geber states in 8th century alchemists, the purpose is to baffle and lead into error anyone except those whom God loves and provides for. Esoteric secrets, symbols, etc., but only those educated in the esoteric language can understand the exoteric skills. And just as Agricole says, all these alchemists employ obscure language. That was the not just the nature of them possibly not having a modern notation and accurate. So in biology we use Latin words. For instance, in chemistry we have a set of words and terms which are set and standardized. So even if that was in existence, there still was the tendency to keep it secret, keep it safe, and use obscure language, etc. This also applies in medicines as well. Next section, we can see in our Babylonian tablet of the 17th century chemistry of every characteristic of the later specialist. The writer makes a point of using the strangest possible cuneiform signs. So even at the language of the time, he was using strange code, strange language within those cuneiform tablets. And at the same time, rare, or for that matter, new values to some of those others which are better known to us. He uses Sumerian ideograms in such a way as to show that he intends to pun on the value of the Semitic equivalents. So Sumerian was cuneiform, and then the later Akkadians, etc., were their language was so the original Sumerian language from the cuneiform. Later people such as the Akkadians, they were actually Semitic speakers, but they adopted the cuneiform language. So that's what he means, Sumerian ideograms and Semitic equivalents. Taking, for instance, the sign for the eagle in Sumerian, which has a Semitic value Eru, which is ingeniously meant here to be read as copper. For whom he intended this text we cannot say, but the handwriting is so beautiful that it suggests the existence of a professional library. And again, even later finds from that period, we see large collections of essentially libraries. Back to the text. His is the most difficult expression of the professional jealousy yet known in Mesopotamia. There is a similar but simpler method employed by Assyrian physicians and astrologers who do not, it is true, attempt any such gross usage of cuneiform signs as this, but they do employ an abbreviated language, different from that of the historical texts, different language, coded language, relying greatly on the use of Sumerian values and certainly warranting the view that they too intended to conceal their professional knowledge from the layman. The rest, we also, for the again, like in this section, you can pause and read, but in regards to the curious terms for medicines, but also in regards to sulfur, and he also mentions, well, again, you can, I'll link this particular book in it, so in the introduction you can find this, and it goes on further. And the secrets of alchemy was a secret in Mesopotamian texts, so we can be sure of that. The same ceramic faience that the Egyptians were making were also probably actually discovered in Mesopotamia first. Okay, this one's also relevant. It is in curious contrast to all this professional jealousy that the unique series of Assyrian glass texts of the 7th century, which were made to the order of, oh God, I always get that, Ashurbanipal, are written in straightforward, simple Assyrian without attempting at cryptography, so that Assyrian laymen might have read them with ease. How an Assyrian king could obtain such professional information in this particular branch when so many of the other specialist classes of tablets in his library are written in technical formula, it is difficult to explain, or it may perhaps be that the medical and astronomical texts are copied from the old originals, while the glass recipes received direct from the dictation of less secretive handicraftsmen who, doubtless illiterate, for some unknown reason handed on their secrets by word of mouth to a scribe who had no axe to grind by hiding their real meaning. Well, if you get your hands on a fella and give time and the right tools, you can convince pretty much anyone to do anything, really. So the skills, the secrets, the glass, the medicines, metallurgy, cadmium, potassium, cinnabar, mercury, these are the essential tools in the later Hermeticist alchemists, and nature dictates that we need them also to work silver and gold, for instance. So there's quite clearly from these surviving texts, this is, again, I don't know why either the alternative or the mainstream are not really examining these things, because there is quite a wealth of knowledge of surviving texts and the artefacts which themselves embed the chemistry to make a particular metal or a chemical or ceramics, for instance. You can't cheat it. There are rules that you can't just magically craft these things. You have to be skilled in these crafts, in these art forms, which are essentially based on science as well. So whether they arrived at them by the scientific method, or whether they arrived at them purely by trial and error, is really irrelevant to the fact that they arrived at them and they were achieving them. That is the important part. So secrets of alchemy, trade secrets, ancient Egyptian alchemy, I believe that Tomb of Nephal and other, for instance, based on the artefacts, based on the comparisons to Mesopotamia, that there was distillation and a much more advanced chemistry / alchemy at those times. SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. You'll find a bunch of links, related videos in the description. Thank you for watching, and again, I'll be looking in future in regards to Egyptian herbs, how they relate to Mesopotamia, and how they influenced later traditions of medicine as well, for instance, because it all relates back to the alchemy of metals, of all these features. You can't really separate these, and there's a lovely amount of the artifacts and the surviving texts, the architecture, tell a very clear story, and rather than drown in looking for mystery, I believe it's very important to isolate what we can explain, and then what's left is mysterious. But I don't think it does anyone any good to if we can exclude everything, then what is left is mysterious. But if things can be explained, that's not a mystery. That's putting the blinkers on. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. As always, there'll be more to come. Cheers.